So we just got some really fascinating insight into one of the most hotly debated PS4 exclusives of its time, and that is the Order 1886. I mean, this game, years later, is still talked about in some way, shape, or form, whether it's about the quality of it, the price tag, and what that did for the game back then versus the time it takes to finish the game, the story, if it deserves a sequel. So often I see this game still come up in conversations for it being a PS4 exclusive that was one and done from Ready at Dawn, where they were historically a long-term PlayStation partner doing games like Daxter, then the God of War series on PSP as well. And there's so much to love about Ready at Dawn's history until they were then acquired by Meta, and they did a few of the VR games, the Lone Echo franchise over there. Then more recently they were shut down. Well, anyway, the point is, we learned a lot from a recent interview over on MinnMax. Again, Ben Hansen absolutely killing it over there lately with interviews. Really fascinating talk. The co-founder, Andrea Pessino, was talking with Ben for a long time, like 2-something hours. It is such a good talk. I encourage you all, again, to watch the whole thing yourself and listen to it and hear so much more than what we're going to discuss. But for us covering PlayStation, we'll cherry pick some things out there that are pertinent to what we want to take a look at, which, for example, would be the fact that Andrea talked about the Order and also Daxter as well. We learned a lot about this game, too, so thought we'd at least start off there. So with Daxter, we did find out that that was actually the most fun and rewarding project that he, Andrea, has ever worked on. So one really cool thing is that before they went to show the game off at E3 2005, they were apparently days away from being closed. Sony was about to pull the plug on the game, but when they showed the game off to Naughty Dog, they loved it, and they thought it was really shaping up to be a good game. And so Andrea even said that it was their first playable where they were using the Cerny method, which it's also funny for him to talk about the Cerny method because that's a whole other separate thing we could even talk about later, but that's just a methodology that Mark Cerny, the PS4, PS5 Vita system architect, also the Pro consoles, obviously, that was his method and ideology of how to approach making games, a sort of production pipeline that decides when to kill or continue making a game, and that would heavily involve a first playable, which is a vertical slice, as a lot of people tend to refer it to as. But the point is, they did the Cerny method, and so he talked about how they had got their PSP dev kits really late, and they only had one initially, and they had to actually share that one dev kit with another studio. So he said they had to ship off that one dev kit to a different team after a week. So it must have been like a back and forth style thing for a little bit, which sounds really annoying and problematic, but Andrea did talk about that. A big problem that they were having with the game, though, is that it ran poorly. They just were not getting good performance out of the PSP since they were having to work primarily on a PC until they eventually got to get this game running on, well, targeted PSP hardware, but they didn't know exactly what they were supposed to be targeting, and so they were doing too many things with the game. That was the initial sort of challenge that Ready at Dawn was facing. They were having this sort of scope creep and trying to have so many different elements in the game, so Sony brought in Michael John to lead design on the game and start to narrow the scope down. Michael John was actually, he used to work with Cerny on Cerny's consulting firm, I should say, back then. But from there, the E3 demo was a huge hit, and they then secured the funding to get the game over the finish line, so Sony did not end up canceling the game, which, Daxter went on to be a fantastic PSP title. But we also learned that Naughty Dog wanted to do a Jak and Daxter game on PSP, and that was a problem because Ready at Dawn would have had no problem doing a sequel to Daxter, but it turns out that Naughty Dog wanted to do Jak and Daxter on PSP as well, which is obviously a bit weird having two teams do separate games on the same IP on the same platform. And so Andrea actually mentioned that Sony would have been okay with that. And he refers to how, like, you had Insomniac and Naughty Dog doing, PS2 platformers, and they sort of embraced that, right? So Sony did want that to happen. They would have had no problem with them doing a Daxter 2, but at that point, Ready at Dawn decided, well, never mind, we'll do something else if you want to do Jak and Daxter on the PSP. We just did Daxter ourselves. We're not going to do more of that, and so that's where the God of War game came in. So that's how they initially went on to do God of War, which, by the way, Naughty Dog, we also learned that this Jak and Daxter game they were doing on the PSP, they were trying to move their dev environment over to the PSP, and they spent a few months working on that. And I guess at some point they just said, nah, this is a nightmare, and they moved on, because obviously we know Naughty Dog did not do Jak and Daxter on PSP. But let's move on to the Order 1886, because this is where some really juicy stuff is talked about, especially the relationship that this studio had with Sony, and that developer-publisher relationship in this case. So Rue, the other co-founder of Ready at Dawn, they spent 6 months with Sony really defining the deal surrounding this game. But leadership got moved around, and that was where Shuhei Yoshida took on more responsibilities and went back to Japan. So that's where things really started to change, and certain conditions that they agreed upon with certain people were no longer there. That was the problem. Now, they didn't leave the company. It's just that they were all moving upwards, and you can't bypass the chain of command and continue working with those people. So it's the new folks that stepped in that you're now having to deal with, and that's what Andrea was getting at. So for him, from this point on in the interview, he carefully explains the sort of friction that happens in the publisher-developer relationship, where it's similar to, as he calls it, blackmail. If they miss a milestone, in their case Ready at Dawn, then they might not receive the funds to make payroll. And he's describing this as a sort of example. Obviously, the topic at this point is the Order 1886. He's not directly saying that's what happened, but he is sort of indirectly using this example during the Order 1886 conversation. So there is also the circumstance and example he used where he said the studio needs X amount of money, but they can only get Y amount. And the management guys at the publisher give a wink wink and make you sign something acknowledging that X is what you really need. So if you go along, sign this, then we can eventually renegotiate. But the problem there is that it's an unspoken promise, and it's basically a breach of contract type of relationship, which is just not really comfortable for anybody involved. Andrea makes a great point here, which is simply, sure, we're in this breach of contract situation, but what are we going to do? Like, sue Sony? We're not in the position to do that. They just don't really have any kind of leverage. So it's all examples, and he also makes it very clear during the entire talk that he's not necessarily looking to name individuals or speak badly about any type of experience that they had, but he does sort of very clearly air out some grievances with this game, or at least how it played out, because the one thing that's obvious about Andrea during this entire talk is that he loves the game's business, and he really loved working on these projects in this game in particular too. So the thing is, with the Order 1886 sequel, here's where we have learned the most we ever had about this game, which is that regardless of everything and the game's shortcomings, the team did still pitch the sequel to Sony, which Andrea didn't say this, but it's the same thing where he's implying that it was clearly a no. But he also says that it might have been a good thing anyway, because if they did go ahead with it, they would have signed their life away, as in the budget would have been smaller, they'd be completely at the mercy of any decisions that Sony makes. They had no leverage at that point, they just weren't in a position to negotiate a good contract. But Andrea does say they would have taken it to have a chance at redeeming the franchise. So at this point, Ben pressed further on the topic, asking if it was because the sales weren't high enough. And Andrea said he doesn't think it was the sales, it was the critical reception. Sony is a very proud group, and they want good games, so he thinks that if the game was even just in the 70s, that they would have had the sequel. He's convinced, he says, that they would have had the sequel. At this point, he also talks about how with the first game, there was just so much that they had to cut, so narrative nuance was removed, or interactive scenes became a movie. The team wanted at least another year making that game, and they just did not get it. And apparently mock reviews for the game as well, which is an industry standard thing that'll happen, and they're often very accurate. So the mock reviews placed the game in the mid-70s, which told the team that, okay, we might be fine to at least have another shot at this game, but it was one of the more uncommon scenarios where the game landed on the lower side for release. But he does openly say, like, they had so much foundation in place since they had to build so many core technologies, and they were very proud of what they were building at the time, and surely they should be, because the Order 1886 is an incredible PS4 game looking back. It's amazing what they were able to accomplish back then, because that game visually still holds up to this day, if we are at least judging it on the visual spectrum here, because there's so many other elements of the game that does fall short, of course. But he says what has always been known from anybody that has played that game, which is, even if you didn't like it, you can see there is such a solid foundation for exploring the franchise further, and that's something that they did want to do, but just the circumstance where Sony did not want to pursue that further. Which, it's so funny how he says that, oh, I don't think it was sales, it was the critical reception, which does track well, both of those things, mind you, because one, it's been said by many others that are owned as a studio, doesn't matter like if you're a senior ranking person there or not, like typically the publisher does not tell the studios like an exact number, here's how well your game sold, which is kind of weird, but I believe that is the standard or the norm, so to speak. So he probably genuinely does not know, although he might have a ballpark figure in his head. But there's that angle of it. And then also the angle of that Sony is not as concerned with sales as they are with the notoriety of their games. They are very proud of the software they put out, and it's so fascinating how we're hearing that from the co-founder of Ready at Dawn, where like that's his position on this franchise, this game that the studio spent so much time working on. He feels that, yeah, the game critically did not deliver what Sony wanted. Now, one could also make the argument of they should have given the studio more time, but there is that friction that he was getting into a little bit there. So that also, I think, is not entirely surprising, given that at a certain point, Sony as a publisher and many others, they do have that sort of backbone of at a certain point we do want results, or the game does have to get out the door. And it's unfortunate that the studio had to find themselves in that position for this particular game, because Andrea did also talk a little bit about the difference between, you know, a studio like them where they're not owned by Sony and what it feels like when you are owned by Sony. And there's a stark difference there as far as your day-to-day operations and what you can expect for milestone builds and things like that. But yeah, for sales too, I mean, the order probably did do reasonably well. I wanted to look into this a bit further, excuse me, because we don't have confirmed sales for this game, obviously, but we do have some guesswork we can do, because if you look at the Insomniac breach data, which was lifetime download sales on PSN, which is not the best metric, but it is something given that this is a 2015 game. So the data is up to at least late 2022. So lifetime download sales for this game on PSN is 1.3 million copies, which, mind you, the game did come out in 2015, and that would be primarily physical software. But the 1.3 million is still a number that was spread out across many years, to where the game is always available for, you know, $10, $5 or something on PSN, whatever it is. It has been given away, obviously, but it's something where the game could slowly drip feed its sales up to 1.3 million. But conceivably, given that the ratio would have been favoring physical a lot more in 2015, the game probably did somewhere in the ballpark of the low multi-millions, right? So 3, 4, maybe up to 5 million. He even mentioned like, oh, it didn't do God of War 2018 numbers, but he's like, yeah, like it did. They probably checked off that box as far as like, do we get a sequel? The one they didn't check off was the critical reception. So that's where we are with the order. We pretty much got as much info as we're reasonably going to get from what was a very good source, the co-founder, Andrea there, which he has been in the industry for a very long time. So it was awesome to hear him talk this long, because he, like Rue, they don't really do this kind of thing often, and that's what's always great about Ben or somebody else getting these interviews, and we get some interesting insight into the development of our favorite games and also what ended up happening for these franchises as well. So The Order is still a really fascinating game, though. If you've not played it, check it out. That way you can join the dialogue of what went wrong with this game. It is still, to this day, a conversation topic that does not seem to die down whenever it does come up. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. We do have a lot of stories coming up on, well, it should be for this coming Friday, right? So if the State of Play happens, we have some Sony financials and whatever else comes up in between. Wanted to get this story out as a separate upload as well, which we might be doing more often nowadays, because it also buys me time for other uploads that have a lot more editing involved. So with that in mind, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.